Okay. I think. Okay. Good evening. I think we should start. Yesterday you gave me a homework, or I committed myself to doing something within the 22 hours between then and now. And I've done a bit of homework and on essentially, what amounts to land ownership patterns. And if you remember, I said yesterday that yesterday and today, I would like to talk about the nature of the problem we're dealing with, which is the situation that the democratic government inherited in 1994. So that's what we're doing yesterday and today. And the issue seems to revolve around land ownership. And the question that was asked, quite a valid question, is that apart from these percentages, could we see something that will give us an idea of what I've been talking about? The name pie chart was raised. I couldn't do that. But I do have useful maps that I'm going to show at the end of what I wanted to talk about today. And then that will be part of today's discussion. Good. We devoted most of yesterday to an overview of the land question in South Africa. As I say, in the period up to the transition of, I like to be accurate with this thing. The period I'm talking about is the transition to 1994. Because when we talk about land reform, we will recall that F.W. de Klerk came up with his own land reform program in 1991 when they were changing and so on. And before 1994, it was possible for blacks to buy land in areas that were designated white. So that happened even before 1994, between 1989 to 1994. I have personal experience. I bought property when I was working at the University of Natal in 1991 in a place called Southridge Park. No? Is it Southridge? Yeah. Or Carrington Heights. And that was a white area. And I was allowed to buy property even there. And what I want today is, so yesterday, we talked about the overview, but then we focused on the former reserves. And there, we showed that in these areas, or these areas were put aside for black Africans, or people who were classified black, the Bantu-speaking indigenous people of South Africa. And just to remind ourselves about the features of these areas, we said that in these areas, land tenure was and continues, is still the case even today, based on rights of occupation rather than ownership. In the maps I'm going to show you, which are based on research that was done by Agri-SA, the Union of Commercial Farmers. They talk very loosely, very glibly about ownership, right? They assume that Africans in the former reserves owned the land. And yet, in terms of what we discussed yesterday, they didn't own the land. They didn't have freehold rights to the land. They had occupation rights. The state was and continues to be the legal owner of that land. There, of course, as I indicated yesterday, exceptions, and I pointed out to the cases of quit rent, which were issued in the late 19th century in the Cape, where there were attempts to establish this group of black commercial farmers. But those were exceptions. And then I indicated that following the Natives' Laws of 1936, land that was put aside for African population occupation, was restricted to 13%, up from 7% in 1913. And this was the situation up to the transition to democracy. So if you're talking of land ownership patterns, affecting the Bantu-speaking people, they had access to land, not ownership, access to land in about 13% of the South African landscape. The maps I'm going to show you show that very clearly, and it's very interesting. We're going to talk about that when we get to that stage. Just to belabor the point, outside the reserves, Africans or the Bantu-speaking indigenous people did not have any rights to own, to buy, and to sell land and property. Unlike their white counterparts, Africans who were interested in using land for their livelihoods, call it agriculture, they did not have, or they did not get any subsidy from the state. State support was, however, extended in the form of government-appointed extension officers. That they had access to. But other forms of subsidies like loans, training, and so on, they were not privileged to. And then lastly, we talked about the administration of land, those areas. And we said that the administration of land was in the hands of state-appointed chiefs and headmen. I use the term state-appointed because in the post-1994 jargon, because the government is interested in the support of chiefs and so on, they call chiefs hereditary. That's not true. The chiefs we have here are state-appointed. And chiefs who stood against colonial policies, apartheid and so on, we know it's recorded, they were removed from their position. And only compliant chiefs were given the title chief and so on. And that's important, then and now. Now, today, I remarked yesterday that we sometimes talk about the land question. Even in my writings, I say, address the land question, 2007, the article that has been circulated, which I wrote 12 years ago on the land question. We say the land question. But as I am growing, becoming wiser, grayer, and so on, and I realized that, to treat the land question as just homogeneous as the land question is misleading. It's misleading. It makes it difficult for one to say, to explain why people want different things when they talk about the land question. And the approach I've been using since 2013 was to try and divide the landscape in South Africa into broadly 5 categories. There might be more, but these 5 categories seem to work for me. First, and this is not by order of their priority, you have your white commercial rural areas. And here we're talking about agricultural land, right? And then you have another category that we focused on yesterday, which is the former reserves, right? And there's a third category that is important in current debates on land, and this is urban areas. It has its own dynamics and so on. People ask different things, and their struggles over land are different. And then, of course, yesterday, I hinted to this, there's also church land. Church land is a huge sort of area, and something that has not received the attention that it deserves. And unfortunately, in this series, I won't dwell on this category of land. It has its own dynamics. I can only make reference to church land. But if you're serious about the land question, and if you're serious in addressing problems arising out of land in South Africa, church land is important, especially those portions of church land that were declared mission stations. Because in those areas, you have people who reside on church land. And the question that arises when it comes to security of tenure is, whose land is church land? And what are the rights of the church goers? Who is the church? It's a big, big topic. I've written a bit about it, but it would require, its own attention. And then the last category that I include in my scheme of things when I try and understand the land question and how we can begin to address this huge elephant is state land. It is state land. And all these categories, and this is one thing that is common about them, is that it's not easy for one to pin down and say that, yes, reserves, X percentage of land is reserves. There are as many figures as there are many researchers so far. Right? Last year, the state tried, released what they called a land audit. Agri-SA came up with their own land audit. Who, academics like us, PLAS, and so on, were up in arms, challenging these figures. And I'm sure end of this day, I have a hint that is going to be debated even here today. People are already asking, what is 80%? 80% of what? What is 100% and so on? That's fine. It's part of the discussion, right? So there are those 5 categories that help me understand the landscape, right? And as I make the presentation, you'll see yesterday, I've dealt with one. Today, I want to deal with the other one, the commercial rural areas, right? And then tomorrow, urban land. And in that context, we'll talk about state land and so on as we move towards addressing this problem. One thing I want to say about these categories, is that there are, in each of them, questions of land that are associated with each area. Granted. However, while there are clearly discernible dynamics associated with each of the 5 land types, there are also broader land-related problems that affect the country as a whole. So what I'm saying here is that we must try and run from the danger of isolating these areas. Treat the communal areas as if they exist on their own and that are not related to a bigger picture. These must be seen within the context of a bigger picture. And the bigger picture, as I said yesterday, in terms of our own history, is racism. It is racism that it's possible to talk about these categories precisely because force and laws were promulgated to advantage and disadvantage various groups. So, solving the land question, this is an example, in the former reserves, cannot be dealt with in isolation to the bigger problem of landlessness. And this is where this expropriation issue comes up. Land is finite. There are people who do not have land, denied access to land. There are people who got land because laws favor them, and we say, no, we want, a peaceful society. How do we do it? How do we divide this cake that won't grow unless we conquer Lesotho? I don't think that's an option. It shouldn't be an option. So, I'm saying this because I want you to understand why this history is so important. It's not just history for its own sake. There is a reason why we start with the history, understand the problem, in order to explore ways in which we can solve or resolve or address, not solve, address that problem. Right. Now, let's go on to commercial farms. The figures, the percentages we'll come to later. Right. Here, what I want to do is to pick up key features of these areas. And at the back of our mind, of course, we'll have the situation as it prevailed in the former Bantustan. So you can begin to compare commercial farms and the former Bantustans or reserves. So one of the features here is that commercial farms form the bulk of agricultural land in South Africa. The land is privately owned. It is held under freehold title deeds. Thirdly, only whites were allowed to own land. And fourthly, as I've already said, the farmers were supported. There was massive state support of various sorts. The thing that has interested us with these areas over the last years. And especially for those of us who are in the Western Cape, after 2012 and 2013, when there were farm worker strikes in this part of the world, the thing that interests us, that made us interested, were farm workers. Who are farm workers? For farm workers, farms are a place of work. That's where they work. But farms are also places of residence. Not all farm workers can be categorized like that. There are farm workers who are migrant workers. Farm workers who would come from the former reserves, who would do a piece of job, seasonal work, and go back home. But the bulk of farm workers, and especially in places like the Western Cape, so-called colored workers, know no other home than the farm. They were born and bred on the farm. Everything that they do on the farm. They can't say home is there. Unlike Bantu-speaking indigenous people, who would go to a farm but will always say, I have a home in the reserves. I have a home, I have cattle, I have livestock, and so on. Some authors refer to this relationship between farmer and worker as domestic government. Others, like Andres du Toit, who is at PLAS, they use the term racial paternalism. And here, what the picture that they are trying to show is that in the context of the farm worker is often regarded as part of the family. You see. The entire family was often at the disposal of the farmer. The farmer would have employed the man, the husband, to do X duties, but there was also an expectation that the wife and children will also work for the farm. But there was no formality saying that, no, they are workers, they are paid this and that. In other words, the entire family was often at the disposal of the farmer, not just the formally employed worker. Workers were seen, and I quote here, I think this is from Andres du Toit, children wholly dependent on the love and discipline of the farm owner. Workers were often paid in kind, which is what we do with our children. Don't give them wages, pay them in kind. But in this particular case, this form of relationship, in some cases took the form of the DOP system. I hope most of us know the DOP system, where farm workers were given alcohol instead of cash as payment. Given the nature and size of farms, it was almost impossible to establish a trade union on farms. When I say the form and nature of farms, I refer to the size of farms. In the Western Cape, these wine farms, they are small compared to what you see in the Free State, where one farmer could own thousands of hectares. Sometimes you drive along the road, you don't see the farmstead. It's over the hill, right? And that's that kind of arrangement where workers know of no other home confined workers to a farm and made it difficult for workers to associate with other workers, which is the advantage that workers in urban areas have. That through work, they come together. And that makes it easy for them to form their own trade unions, but not with commercial farms. Then, picture is changing now. Indeed, commercial farms fell outside the parameters of labor legislation. You remember when the Vihan Commission was set up, was it in the 70s? When trade unionism was on the rise in South Africa after the repression of 1960. All those negotiations, those agreements and so on, did not necessarily affect farms. So they were not part of the labor situation that was transforming in South Africa in the transition. And of course, the fact that they were not protected by law made it easy for the farmers to exploit these workers. The other thing that that is important for my work, especially as I do research in the Western Cape, is that the heterogeneous nature of farm workers. That whereas in the former reserves, residents were the Bantu-speaking indigenous people, on these farms, you find that, yes, there were migrant workers from the reserves. There were Bantu-speaking people who were born, grew up on the farms, but then there were also colored workers. And, those racial divisions that were caused by the classification of especially the apartheid regime, are important to bear in mind when you do research on farm workers. You can't just generalize. Good. In a nutshell, and you must prepare now for this, in a nutshell, conditions on commercial farms on the eve of our democracy were characterized by, one, exclusive white ownership of land. And secondly, they were characterized by unbearable labor relations with respect to farm workers. So that would be sort of my summary of this sector of our landscape that might be useful when we look at what has happened from 1994 to date. Okay, now I want to finish my presentation and allow sufficient time for us to engage by reporting on my findings. And these maps are drawn from the report of Agri SA. I've chosen this report not because I agree with especially their reasoning and the percentages, the figures. And I've just pointed out one sort of point of difference between what they say and how I put things on the question of ownership. Question of ownership is very important. You can't say that people in the former homelands own land, even now. And with the Ingonyama Trust and what is happening in KwaZulu-Natal, it's becoming clear that ownership must be given its legal meaning. not used glibly. But despite that, I thought that there are interesting things that we could talk about here. Now, this report combines state land in the form of national parks and the tribal authority areas. Well, I mean, they say national parks, and we'll see, the percent. In fact, you should, why don't you go to 5? Maybe 5 would be. Yes. Yep, 1994. Right? And here, you will see, this is agricultural land as a 1990. What is agricultural land? Yes. These are the percentages, you see. What is interesting here, that is not said in the first diagram, is that you'll see that in the Northern Cape, this is agricultural land that was at the disposal of blacks. And you will see that in the Northern Cape, in the Western Cape, and those two in Gauteng. And of course, Gauteng then was mainly what? Gauteng, PWV, right? Pretoria, the so-called Vereeniging, and Witwatersrand. There were no homelands, right? And that, you have these percentages only in those provinces. There are 9 now, there were 4 then. But in only those provinces where there were homelands. And we know that in Limpopo there were a couple of homelands. Northwest, there were homelands, Mangope, Botswana, it was so. And then KwaZulu-Natal, of course. And the Eastern Cape, Free State, small percentage, right? But they were. And Mpumalanga, too. So you can see here what the picture was in 1994. So when we say that the bulk of the land was in white hands, right? The Western Cape, Northern Cape, Gauteng, areas that are very important in terms of the economy of the country, especially the Western Cape and Gauteng. Blacks did not have access to land and property in those areas, right? So, can we go back to 1? 1, of course, this, the sort of the yellow, sometimes they say men are colorblind. Is this orange? Orange, these are the tribal areas. As you can see, they are mainly in this part of the world, and here, there's none. And then you have your national parks. This is not clear enough. They seem to be few. There's not.
Does that include provincial? When you say national
yes.
What does that mean?
National parks. This is the whole of South Africa. Well, that might be the problem. This is Agri-SA, it's not my diagram. But I think what I said is that what it does is that at least it gives you an idea of where these things were happening, where these Bantustans were, and how land ownership patterns work. It's not the exact percentages and so on. No one disputes that in the Western Cape there were no Bantustans. And that Bantu speaking people.
So not many black people lived in Western Cape. First of all, they never came down there. But second of all, there were apartheid wouldn't allow black people to have jobs in Western Cape.
That's the point I've been making. But there were black people who were living in the Western Cape, certainly in 1994.
They were not supposed to be seen then.
Yes, they were hidden. Yeah. They were hidden. There was Khayelitsha. there was Langa, there was Guguletu, there was Crossroads. It was growing. But no, when you look at the map, they were not there. They were invisible, or they were made invisible, right? Just show the second map now, because no. Yeah, no, I think it's clearer, but what I liked with this map was that it also shows a third category other than national parks and so on, and that's what they call built-up areas. And I assume that they are referring to cities, towns, and so on. And you can see here, this is the Western Cape, and this would be Gauteng, and this would be Natal, Eastern Cape, patches of towns in the Eastern Cape. And this reminds me of what people often ask me when they say that there is land shortage. They say, no, but then why do you say there's land shortage in South Africa when you can drive for kilometers on end on land that is not occupied? And which I think is a good point. Because here you can see that it's built up areas, traditional authority and national parks. But they seem to be a small percentage. Now the last point, what is the next one? Was it 5? Oh yeah, no, I know, I don't think that one is going to be helpful. But the point I want to make here is that in 1994, it was estimated that whites owned 79. That's what this report says. 79% of agricultural land. And the traditional authority areas and state owned, according to this report, about 15% of agricultural land. Now the report is the way it's written, is almost bullet points. There's no argument, there are no points that are elaborated upon. It does not tell us what they regard as agricultural land. Because in these homelands, talking about an area that I have investigated, in depth, in the former reserves, there are towns. It's not just rural areas. There are towns. What percentage of the 13% comprised towns or built-up areas? And what percentage comprised the rural areas under chiefs? And in those areas, we know that as a result of overcrowding, one cannot really talk about agriculture. But at the same time, one cannot generalize and say that there was no agriculture in those areas. Because in some of these places, there were development projects, like irrigation schemes, right? In the Eastern Cape, Ngoga, Kamata, Matanzma's stronghold, had a huge dam, and they were producing for an external market. So there was agriculture. These generalizations, of course, as an academic, we don't accept that, making these wild generalizations and so on. But on the whole, you cannot say that in the town, in the former reserves, 15% of the land was agricultural. You need to do research that will not only be quantitative, relying on what you get from Google and so on, important as it is, but it also requires that we send out our students to do research, qualitative research, visit households, observe what's happening there. Something that can only be done in the long term, not something that can be done. Sometimes the government asks you a very complicated question and say that we want a report when? Next week. It's not that kind of research that will help us understand these percentages. But to go back to where I started, I think what AgriSA has done for us should be lauded. It's a starting point. It gives us a basis to say yes and no and take the process further. Whew.
Meaning of class there.
Class, land capacity class.
It would be arable. It's arable.
Yes,
What's arable? Because there's
Yes.
another one where there is water available.
water, yes.
Because there's the Karoo and the Northern Cape. I mean, it's not very arable for living and farming because there's no water.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah. But, I mean, this is Agri-SA, and most of what they say in this is 37 pages. And what they are saying in that report now is they also identify areas where there's a potential, to do agriculture and so on. And quite frankly, that's not my strong point, the agricultural side of things.
There might be errors in the work they've done.
Yes.
But I think what they were trying to do, and I can't recall this, but I did look at it at
Uh-huh.
the time,
Yes.
is they were trying to say that an acre of land in the Karoo
Yes.
is not equal to an acre of land in the Natal Midlands or in
Western Cape.
sugar,
Yeah.
sugar fields of Natal.
Yes.
And they were trying to look at, rather than square meters or acres,
Yes.
the actual production potential.
Yes.
Now, I can't recall this particular diagram,
Yes.
but I actually thought that was a very sensible approach.
It was.
If you're looking for the productivity or the capacity of the land
Yes.
and measuring it on that basis. And it's somewhere in that report.
Yes. In fact, no, they do both. Because they talk about the size of land in hectares. But they also sort of talk about the value of land.
Correct.
Yeah. Which cannot be reduced in the size of the land. It's the quality of land and so on.
In other words, if it's cattle, how many cattle can you run?
Mm-hmm.
Can you run? When you're planting maize, what do you produce here? What do you produce there?
Yeah.
Looking at
Well, I mean, from sort of my sort of research and so on and knowledge of this field, that argument is not new, and people always contest it. They contest it on the basis of what technology can do. That an area could be arid today, but if you introduce a borehole and so on, it could be productive, depending on the level of technology that you put in, and of course, training people. Stellenbosch. I mean, I don't know. I mean, one time I read about a cow with a name Macy or something that was being milked every 3 hours. Producing liters and liters of milk. And if you had to tell that to my grandfather, who was a successful livestock owner, he would say that I need to be examined upstairs. Okay.
So did you mean then, you said there was a figure of 79%.
Agricultural land.
1994. So that 79% is agriculturally, commercially used farmland. Is that true?
They may.
You don't understand that?
No.
So that's commercially used, commercially, not tribal, not legal. You said you passed the figure 79%.
Well, in the report, I mean, maybe you can help me. In the report, I read this report today. In the report, they say agricultural land. And you questioning the 79%, I question the 15%.
No, I'm not questioning. Is that a true figure? 79%? Because that is actually what's used in the press and the media at present. We always talk about agricultural
Yes.
expropriation of commercially used.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, when we discuss land reform, I'll make the distinction between the land question and land reform. Land reform is about agricultural land. And my argument is that the land question goes far beyond agriculture and the rural, which is why I incorporate church land. I mean, not just an urban land. Because those percentages exclude urban land. As if there are no land struggles in urban areas. Well, there's a beach thing that was happening. We had on, was it New Year's Eve? Who's from Clifton? So there are land struggles all over. So if you're talking about the land question, we have to go beyond land reform. And part of the problem is that the state talks about land reform as if it is the land question. And that's part of the confusion. And that's why it's important. I find it very useful to have these categories of land and then look at the struggles in each of these before relating it in the broader context of where we come from historically, especially the issue of racism. At the back.
I think you might be going through it tomorrow, so if you are, you can just tell me that you'll do it. I wanted to ask specifically in areas like Gauteng, areas like the Western Cape, when we're talking about the towns, and I just wanted to know what the type of land ownership was in townships specifically. Did they have free form land rights?
Well, no, after the Group Areas Act, and I'm going to deal with that tomorrow. Yeah, but after the Group Areas Act, the state took it upon themselves to build houses for Africans who were workers here. But those houses were never sold to the workers. They occupied the workers. Remember yesterday I used the term sojourner, that blacks in white South Africa in the cities were seen as temporary residents with a home back in the former reserve. And this is part of it. That's why we have these, we call them housing. Sort of, but because these are land struggles as they manifest themselves in urban areas. And they cannot be dissociated from the broader issue of land. Because who wants land in the Western Cape? You'll find that if you go to Khayelitsha, everybody that I meet there now comes from the Eastern Cape. Yeah. And if you're in the Eastern Cape during December, and you're back here now, you meet those people in the Eastern Cape, and you meet them here again. and they never stop coming. The schooling is getting worse in the Western Cape, so they come here. The medical services are terrible. They bring their people here. So if your planner, if there are planners here assisting the Western Cape and so on, they think that they can plan housing and not take into account what is happening elsewhere in the Eastern Cape in particular, they'll never resolve the problem. They will never.
How do you distinguish between state land and municipal land belonging to the city?
Well, no, the municipality is an arm of the state. They might be autonomous. They are autonomous in terms of the Constitution. But they are part of the state. They are not independent. They are not like your farm owner who says that this is my land. I'll sell this tomorrow. If the municipality wants to do that, they have to apply. Yes.
Many years ago, when I was hitchhiking through Transkei, the hotel manager said he wanted the chief's people to plant vegetables for him, but the chief wouldn't allow it. So has the chief got so much power to say what people can do on this stuff?
They do, or they did. They did, especially, in Transkei, because even in KwaZulu-Natal, almost, the chief minister was himself a chief, Matanzima. So he wouldn't betray, his own tribe. And they were powerful. They were powerful. If they were powerful, they even had, in my work, I argue that they had stronger powers than the magistrate. Remember, in these homelands, the magistrate was not just a judicial officer. the magistrate was also an administrator. It is the magistrate who signed the certificate of occupation, but the magistrate would never sign that piece of paper if it didn't have the signature of the chief. If you went straight to the magistrate because you say, no, look, by law, you are the person who issues this, the magistrate will tell you, go back to your chief. And if you can't negotiate with the chief, you don't have land.
Excuse me, do the people that live on the chief's land, are they ever going to be able to own their own houses? Or
First of all, I mean, though, traditionally, the chief never owned land. You see. But the state has given chiefs, and legally, even now, the chiefs don't own the land. But they have been given sufficient powers to treat the land as if it's theirs. You
So they
see.
can chase somebody off
Of course.
essentially it's a feud.
Yes. Well, looks like the feudal system. But I mean, if we had weeks doing this, I would talk about how residents have responded to chiefs. Some of you, I mean, the most famous reaction that we come across in history was when people in Pondoland reacted against the Bantu authorities. And we had what became known as the Pondo Revolt that Gavin Beki writes about. That was 1960. So there have been no protests. People have been challenging chiefs. The case in Kolobeni, in Pondoland now, around mining, the Australian company and so on, it is ordinary people in that village who went to the High Court and challenged the chief who wants who's inviting the the mining company. It's not only the chief that they are challenging even the minister, Gwede Mantashe. And tomorrow, I'll tell you what happened now. But tomorrow, Gwede Mantashe, despite the court order, is going to that area and promoting this company. I don't know whether it's going to do it, but I'm told that 16th, he scheduled a meeting there. But there's a court order that says that they must not do that.
Your lecture title talks about communal areas.
Yes.
What is a communal area and who has jurisdiction over it?
Communal areas are the reserves. But to be precise here, it is the rural areas of the former reserves, not the towns. In the towns, my father had property in town, he had freehold title in Transkei. But he wouldn't have no title in the village. In the town where I was born, there was a municipality and there were bylaws. We were bound by the bylaws of the municipality, not the chief next door. So communal areas would be the rural areas of the former Bantusans under the jurisdiction of chiefs.